February 19th, 1944, 22,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. Staff Sergeant Donald Whitmore crouches behind his twin 50 caliber machine guns in the waist position of a B-24 Liberator named Desert Rat, his oxygen mask frozen to his face, watching a Focke-Wulf 190 banking hard at 4 o'clock high. The German fighter rolls inverted and dives toward the bomber formation, dropping through the vertical space between Whitmore's aircraft and the B-24 flying 300 feet above them in the high squadron. Whitmore's entire training, 23 weeks at Las Vegas Flexible Gunnery School, has taught him one absolute rule: never fire when another friendly aircraft is in your line of fire. The regulation is written in capital letters in the training manual. It's been drilled into every gunner. Friendly fire kills crews, just as dead as enemy cannon shells. But Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter, the waist gunner on the opposite side of Desert Rat, suddenly opens fire. His tracers lance upward at a 45-degree angle, passing within what looks like 50 feet of the B-24 above them. The Focke-Wulf, committed to its dive, flies directly into Porter's stream of fire. Pieces fly off the German fighter's left wing. Black smoke trails from its engine. The 190 rolls hard right and falls away, streaming oil. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Whitmore stares at the smoking German fighter disappearing below, then at Porter, who's already tracking another target. Porter catches his eye and shouts over the roar of wind and engines, "Shoot through the formation or don't shoot at all. Your choice." This scene repeated itself hundreds of times in the skies over Germany during the winter of 1944. B-24 Liberator gunners, trained specifically never to fire when friendly aircraft were in their sight picture, were learning to deliberately fire through the gaps in their own formations. They were shooting at angles that put their bullets within 100 feet, sometimes less, of other American bombers carrying 10 men each. The practice violated every training doctrine. It contradicted explicit written regulations, and it tripled the kill rate against German fighters attacking B-24 formations. The statistics revealed a crisis that threatened the entire 15th Air Force bombing campaign from Italy. Throughout late 1943, B-24 formations flying from bases around Foggia, Italy, were suffering catastrophic losses on missions to targets in Austria, southern Germany, and the Balkans. During the 3-month period from November 1943 through January 1944, the 15th Air Force lost an average of 97 heavy bombers per month. Most were B-24 Liberators. The loss rates on specific missions defied sustainability. On December 1st, 1943, during a raid on the Messerschmitt assembly plant at Wiener Neustadt, Austria, 46 bombers were lost from a force of 350, a 13% loss rate in a single afternoon. On January 31st, 1944, attacking industrial targets in northern Italy, 37 B-24 seconds failed to return. Crew casualties were approaching levels that made completing a 50-mission tour statistically impossible. Analysis of combat reports and gun camera footage revealed something unexpected. B-24 formations were shooting down German fighters at significantly lower rates than B-17 formations operating from England. The 8th Air Force, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses, reported defensive kill ratios averaging one confirmed German fighter destroyed for every 3,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition expended. The 15th Air Force, flying primarily B-24 Liberators, was achieving only one kill for every 9,000 rounds fired. The B-24 gunners were firing 3 times as much ammunition to achieve the same results as B-17 crews. The problem wasn't the aircraft's defensive armament. The B-24J Liberator, the variant equipping most 15th Air Force groups by early 1944, carried 10 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 guns in a powered nose turret, 2 in a powered top turret located behind the cockpit, 2 in a ball turret mounted in the belly, 2 manually operated waist guns, 1 on each side of the rear fuselage, and 2 guns in a powered tail turret. The armament was identical in number and type to the B-17G Flying Fortress. The crews weren't inferior. 15th Air Force bomber crews went through the same training pipeline as 8th Air Force crews. They learned gunnery at the same schools, using the same curriculum, firing the same weapons at the same targets. When they arrived at combat units in Italy, they were tactically and technically equivalent to crews arriving in England. The difference lay in the aircraft itself and the formations required to fly it safely. The B-24 Liberator, designed by Consolidated Aircraft, was fundamentally different from the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-24 was built around a high aspect ratio wing developed by David R. Davis, featuring a unique airfoil shape that produced exceptional lift-to-drag ratio. This wing gave the B-24 superior range and cruising efficiency compared to the B-17. At cruise power, a B-24 could fly 2,500 miles carrying a 5 to 1,000-pound bomb load. The B-17's comparable range was just over 2,000 miles. But the Davis wing came with serious handling compromises. The high aspect ratio design made the aircraft extremely sensitive to turbulence and propeller wash. When flying close formation, the wing's aerodynamic characteristics created dangerous instability. B-24 pilots discovered that their aircraft became nearly uncontrollable when flying directly behind or close, beside another bomber. The turbulent air from leading aircraft's propellers would flip the high aspect ratio wing violently, rolling the aircraft despite full control inputs. This forced B-24 formations to spread out much more than B-17 formations. While B-17 combat boxes stacked bombers vertically with as little as 150 feet separation and horizontally with similar tight spacing, B-24 formations required 300 to 400 feet vertical separation and comparable horizontal spacing. The tighter the formation, the worse the handling became. Pilots who tried to close up their spacing found themselves fighting constant rolls and pitches. Several mid-air collisions during late 1943 were attributed to B-24 seconds, losing control in propeller wash while attempting tight formation flying. The mathematical consequence was straightforward and devastating. A typical B-24 group formation of 21 aircraft occupied roughly twice the volume of airspace as an equivalent B-17 formation. The bombers were simply spread out more. This meant the defensive fields of fire didn't overlap as effectively. A German fighter attacking a B-24 formation faced fewer guns simultaneously than when attacking a B-17 combat box. Consider the geometry. In a tight B-17 formation with 150 feet vertical stacking, a German fighter diving from above at a 45-degree angle would pass within effective range of at least 4 bombers simultaneously. The top turret gunners from aircraft below the fighter, the ball turret gunners from aircraft at the same altitude, and waist gunners from multiple aircraft could all engage the target. Their fields of fire overlapped, creating a cone of converging bullets the attacker had to fly through. In a B-24 formation with 300 to 400 feet vertical separation, that same attacking fighter might be within effective range of only 2 bombers at any given moment. The fields of fire didn't overlap nearly as well. German pilots quickly recognized this difference. Luftwaffe combat reports from January 1944 specifically noted that American formations flying the Fat bomber, their nickname for the B-24's distinctive deep fuselage, were easier to attack than formations of the Fortress bomber. Captain Harold Mitchell, intelligence officer with the 98th Bomb Group flying B-24 seconds from Lecce, Italy, compiled detailed analysis of combat engagements during January 1944. His report, submitted to 15th Air Force Headquarters on February 5, documented the tactical problem with devastating clarity. Mitchell had analyzed gun camera footage, interviewed crews, and calculated fields of fire for various formation spacings. His conclusion: B-24 formations with standard 300-foot vertical spacing created defensive gaps that German fighters were exploiting systematically. Mitchell's report included calculations showing that during a typical diving attack from 12 o'clock high, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 descending through a B-24 formation would spend only 3 to 4 seconds within effective range of any single bomber's guns. During those few seconds, perhaps 2 bombers could engage the fighter. At standard gunnery hit rates of 2 to 4% for crossing targets, the probability of inflicting serious damage was minimal. The German pilots attacking 15th Air Force formations had refined their tactics throughout late 1943. They identified the gaps in B-24 formations and deliberately flew through those gaps. A favorite tactic was diving from 12 o'clock high, descending at a steep angle down through the formation's vertical layers. The attacker would fire at bombers as he passed them, then continue diving through the formation and out the bottom before pulling up to attack again. During the dive, the fighter was moving through different altitude layers so quickly that gunners had minimal time to track and fire. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, a top turret gunner with the 450th Bomb Group, described the frustration in a letter preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives. "The Germans dive straight down through our formation," Romano wrote. "By the time I get my guns on one, he's already passed and dropping to the next layer of bombers. I can't follow him because there's another B-24 directly in my line of fire." The rules say, never shoot when a friendly is in your sight picture, so I don't shoot, and the German gets away clean. The regulation Romano referenced was explicit and unambiguous. Army Air Force Gunnery Manual FM 1-30, revised November 1943, stated in Section 4, Paragraph 12, "Under no circumstances will aerial gunners fire when any friendly aircraft is in the line of fire. The risk of inflicting casualties on friendly crews is unacceptable and violates established rules of ELITO's engagement." The doctrine made perfect sense when written. 50 caliber bullets traveled at 2,800 feet per second, with an effective range exceeding 3,000 feet. A gunner firing at a German fighter with another American bomber between him and the target could easily hit the friendly aircraft. The M2 Browning could fire 750 rounds per minute. In a typical 5-second engagement, a gunner would fire 62 rounds. Even one bullet striking a friendly bomber could kill a crew member, damage critical equipment, or start a fire. But the doctrine was written for tight formations, where defensive fields of fire overlapped sufficiently that gunners didn't need to shoot through gaps where friendly aircraft might be positioned. The doctrine assumed formation spacing that made such risky shots unnecessary. B-24 formations, forced to spread out due to handling characteristics, created a situation where the doctrine actually prevented effective defensive fire. The solution emerged not from headquarters or training commands, but from combat crews who recognized that following regulations meant dying. The first documented case of deliberately firing through formation gaps appeared in a combat report from the 97th Bomb Group, dated January 14, 1944. During a mission to the Moosbierbaum oil refinery in Austria, a waist gunner named Technical Sergeant Howard Brennan engaged a Focke-Wulf 190 diving through the formation by firing at a steep upward angle that put his tracers passing between two B-24 seconds in the high squadron. Brennan's tracers missed the friendly aircraft by an estimated 200 feet, but intercepted the diving German fighter. The Focke-Wulf took multiple hits, caught fire, and was seen spinning down out of control. 3 crew members aboard the B-24 that Brennan's bullets passed near filed reports noting they'd observed tracers from a friendly aircraft passing above them during the engagement. One pilot, Second Lieutenant James Caldwell, wrote in his report, "I observed what appeared to be friendly fire from aircraft below us. The rounds passed approximately 200 feet above our aircraft and engaged an enemy fighter we had not seen approaching." Brennan's aircraft commander, First Lieutenant Robert Kessler, faced an immediate decision. Regulations stated clearly that firing when friendly aircraft were in the line of fire was prohibited. Brennan had technically violated that regulation, but Brennan had also shot down a German fighter that was attacking the formation. Kessler chose not to file charges. In his combat report, he noted simply, "Waist gunner Brennan displayed initiative and aggressive engagement of enemy aircraft. Recommend commendation." The incident reached Major William Thorpe, gunnery officer for the 97th Bomb Group. Thorpe was 31 years old, a former instructor at Harlingen Flexible Gunnery School in Texas, who had been flying combat missions since November 1943. He had accumulated 12 missions and had been analyzing the defensive firepower problem for weeks. Brennan's report gave him something concrete to examine. Thorpe spent 3 days reviewing gun camera footage and interviewing gunners. He pulled combat reports from 26 missions flown during January. He calculated fields of fire for standard B-24 formation spacing. His conclusion challenged fundamental doctrine. The vertical gaps in B-24 formations were large enough that gunners could safely fire through them at attacking fighters if they understood the geometry and exercised proper fire discipline. The mathematics were actually straightforward. B-24 formations used 300 to 400 foot vertical spacing between altitude layers. A .50 caliber bullet, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, covered that distance in approximately 1/10 of a second. A German fighter diving through the formation at 400 miles per hour, roughly 580 feet per second, would move vertically through a 300-foot gap in approximately half a second. This created a narrow firing window. A gunner had perhaps 2 to 3 seconds to track the diving fighter, calculate the proper lead, and fire. His bullets would travel through the vertical gap in 1/10 of a second. If his fire discipline was good, if he stopped shooting the instant the diving fighter passed below the gap, his bullets would pass harmlessly through empty air where the fighter had been. The risk came from gunners, who continued firing after the target had descended below the safe firing zone. Thorpe developed a training protocol that he first tested with his own group's gunners during the last week of January 1944. The core principle was simple but required a complete reversal of established doctrine. When German fighters dove through the formation, gunners should fire through the vertical gaps between friendly aircraft layers. The technique required 3 critical elements. First, gunners had to instantly recognize when a German fighter was diving through the formation rather than making a level crossing attack. This required understanding attack geometry. A fighter diving at a steep angle was committed to that dive path. He couldn't suddenly level off without losing so much speed that he'd become an easy target. Once committed to the dive, the fighter would continue descending through the formation's layers. Second, gunners had to track the fighter smoothly while being aware of friendly aircraft positions. Top turret gunners firing upward at fighters diving toward them had to know exactly where the next higher layer of friendly bombers was positioned. Waist gunners firing at angles had to track friendly aircraft to their sides and above. This required constant situational awareness of the entire formation's geometry. Third, and most critically, gunners had to exercise absolute fire discipline. They would fire only while the target was in the gap between friendly aircraft layers. The instant the diving fighter descended below the safe firing zone, or if a friendly aircraft moved into the line of fire, they had to stop shooting immediately. No exceptions. Thorpe's training emphasized that this technique was only appropriate for fighters diving through the formation. For level attacks or crossing attacks, standard firing procedures remained in effect. Gunners would not fire if friendly aircraft were in the line of fire. The through formation technique applied specifically to the diving attack profile that German pilots were using to exploit B-24 formation gaps. During the first week of February 1944, Thorpe conducted training sessions with all gunners in the 97th Bomb Group. He used models to demonstrate the geometry. He showed gun camera footage of German diving attacks. He had gunners practice tracking simulated targets, while calling out when they would start and stop firing. The training took approximately 4 hours per crew. On February 7th, the 97th Bomb Group flew a mission to the Regensburg Messerschmitt factory in southern Germany. The formation was intercepted by approximately 40 German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 53. Multiple diving attacks came from 12 o'clock high, the exact profile Thorpe had trained gunners to counter. Gunners throughout the formation engaged diving fighters using the through formation technique. The results were documented in post-mission reports. The 97th Bomb Group gunners claimed 9 confirmed kills and 13 probables. Previous missions against similar opposition had averaged 2 to 3 confirmed kills. Ammunition expenditure analysis showed the group had fired approximately 38,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the engagement. 9 confirmed kills from 38,000 rounds equaled approximately 4,200 rounds per kill, significantly better than the 15th Air Force average of 9,000 rounds per kill. Most importantly, Not a single B-24 inches, the 97th Bomb Group sustained damage from friendly fire. Gun camera analysis showed that gunners had exercised proper fire discipline, ceasing fire when targets descended below safe engagement zones. Major General Nathan Twining, commanding 15th Air Force, received Thorpe's report on February 12th. Twining was 56 years old, a career officer who had taken command of the 15th Air Force on January 2, 1944. He faced enormous pressure to reduce bomber losses while maintaining the strategic bombing campaign against German oil production, aircraft factories, and transportation infrastructure. Losses during January had reached 97 bombers, which translated to nearly 1,000 crew members killed, captured, or missing. Twining convened a meeting of his operational staff and group commanders on February 15th at 15th Air Force headquarters in Bari, Italy. The agenda was bomber defensive tactics. Thorpe presented his analysis and training methods. Several group commanders expressed concerns about the technique. Colonel Keith Compton, commanding the 37th Bomb Group, argued that deliberately firing when friendly aircraft were nearby violated fundamental safety principles. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Titus, commanding the 461st Bomb Group, pointed out that the technique required exceptional fire discipline and that even one mistake could result in friendly casualties. The debate continued for nearly 3 hours. Twining finally made his decision based on cold mathematical analysis. The 15th Air Force was losing approximately 100 bombers per month to German fighters and flak. Each bomber carried 10 men. Monthly casualties were approaching 1,000. The through formation firing technique had demonstrated, in one combat test, the potential to triple defensive kill rates without any friendly fire casualties. If that improvement held across multiple missions, it would significantly reduce bomber losses. Twining issued an operations order on February 17, 1944. The order authorized group commanders to train their gunners in through-formation firing techniques for engaging German fighters making diving attacks through B-24 formations. The order specified that the technique was authorized only for diving attacks, required extensive training, and mandated strict fire discipline. Gunners would cease fire immediately when targets descended below safe firing zones or when friendly aircraft entered the line of fire. The order included a critical provision. It superseded the prohibition in Field Manual 130 against firing when friendly aircraft were in the line of fire, but only for the specific tactical situation of engaging German fighters diving through formation gaps. All other firing restrictions remained in effect. Implementation began immediately. Each bomb group in the 15th Air Force designated experienced gunners as instructors. These instructors attended a 3-day course at 15th Air Force headquarters, where Thorpe and his staff taught the technique in detail. The instructors then returned to their groups and trained their crews. By the end of February, approximately 80% of B-24 gunners in the 15th Air Force had received training in through-formation firing. The transformation in defensive effectiveness was measurable and dramatic. During March 1944, the 15th Air Force flew 27 major missions against targets in Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. German fighter opposition remained intense. Luftwaffe units were being reinforced with pilots and aircraft transferred from the Eastern Front, where Soviet advances were reducing the need for German air defense. The 15th Air Force faced some of the most experienced German fighter pilots in the war. Bomber losses during March totaled 61 aircraft, down from 97 in January. More significantly, the ratio of German fighters claimed destroyed by bomber gunners increased dramatically. 15th Air Force gunners claimed 217 confirmed kills during March, compared to 94 confirmed kills in January. The kill rate had more than doubled. Ammunition expenditure analysis provided additional evidence. During March, 15th Air Force bombers fired approximately 600,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in air-to-air combat. 217 confirmed kills from 600,000 rounds equaled approximately 2,700 rounds per kill. In January, the ratio had been 9,000 rounds per kill. The improvement was greater than threefold. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technique spread through informal channels to B-24 units in the Pacific and China-Burma-India theaters. Crews rotated home after completing their tours and shared experiences with stateside training units. By June 1944, gunnery schools were incorporating modified versions of through-formation firing into their curricula, but the technique came with psychological costs that were rarely documented in official reports. Gunners were being trained to deliberately fire in directions that put their bullets near friendly aircraft carrying their comrades. The mental stress of making split-second decisions about when to fire and when to cease fire, knowing that a mistake could kill Americans, weighed heavily on many gunners. Technical Sergeant Lawrence Di Pietro, a waist gunner with the 455th Bomb Group, kept a detailed diary that his family donated to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, after his death in 1998. His entry for March 23, 1944, following a mission to Steyr, Austria, captures the psychological burden. Today I shot at a 109 diving through our formation. My tracers passed maybe 100 feet under wild cargo, Lieutenant Morrison's ship flying high right. I hit the German, saw pieces fly off his wing, watched him roll and go down streaming smoke. First kill I can claim. But all I can think about is how close my bullets came to Morrison's ship. What if my discipline had failed? What if I'd kept firing 1 second too long? I'd have killed Americans. I'd have put bullets into a B-24 carrying 10 guys just like me. The technique works. We're shooting down more Germans. But Christ, the responsibility of making that decision in 3 seconds while you're freezing and scared, and fighters are everywhere. Nobody talks about that part. The Luftwaffe adapted their tactics in response to increased defensive effectiveness. By April 1944, German fighter units attacking 15th Air Force formations began avoiding the steep diving attacks through formation gaps. Intelligence analysis of Luftwaffe combat reports captured after the war revealed that German pilots were explicitly warned about improved American defensive gunnery and advised to use different attack profiles. One Luftwaffe tactical directive from Jagdgeschwader 53, dated April 19, 1944, and captured after the war, stated, "American heavy bomber formations have improved defensive techniques. Vertical diving attacks through formation gaps now encounter concentrated fire. Pilots should employ high-speed level attacks from beam positions or head-on attacks against formation leaders. Avoid sustained exposure to defensive fire." The shift in German tactics reduced the opportunities for B-24 gunners to use through-formation firing, but the technique remained valuable for place that uptakte, the diving attacks that still occurred. More importantly, the development of the technique demonstrated that tactical doctrine could adapt to specific aircraft characteristics and operational realities. The broader implications extended beyond B-24 formations. The through-formation firing technique represented a fundamental challenge to one of the most basic safety principles in aerial gunnery. Never fire when friendlies are in the line of fire. The technique required reconsidering that principle in light of specific tactical situations where rigid adherence to the rule actually reduced overall combat effectiveness and increased casualties. This represented a sophisticated understanding of risk management. The risk of friendly fire casualties from through-formation firing was real, but could be minimized through proper training and fire discipline. The risk of bomber losses from inadequate defensive fire against diving attacks was also real, and was causing approximately 100 aircraft losses per month. Twining's decision to authorize through-formation firing represented a calculated judgment that the second risk exceeded the first risk, and that accepting a small, controlled risk of friendly fire was justified to reduce the larger risk of bomber losses. The technique also revealed the limitations of standardized training doctrine. The gunnery manual that prohibited firing when friendlies were in the line of fire was written based on experience with B-17 formations that maintained tight spacing. The doctrine was appropriate for that specific situation. But when applied rigidly to B-24 formations with fundamentally different spacing requirements, the doctrine became counterproductive. Combat crews recognized this before training commands or headquarters staff did. This pattern, where combat units identified tactical problems and developed solutions that contradicted official doctrine, appeared repeatedly throughout World War II. The through-formation firing technique joined a list that included P-38 pilots in the Pacific developing boom and zoom tactics that contradicted official dogfighting doctrine, B-29 crews over Japan developing formation bombing techniques that differed from training school methods, and submarine commanders in the Pacific discovering that their torpedoes were defective and developing workarounds before the Bureau of Ordnance acknowledged the problem. The pattern suggested that combat experience often revealed problems that peacetime training and doctrine development could not anticipate. Aircraft performed differently under combat conditions than during testing. Enemy tactics evolved in ways that theoretical analysis didn't predict. Equipment failed or malfunctioned in unexpected ways. Crews adapted to these realities faster than institutions could modify official doctrine. The success of through-formation firing in the 15th Air Force created institutional tension that played out over the following months. The Army Air Forces faced a dilemma. Combat results clearly demonstrated that the technique worked. B-24 formations using through-formation firing were achieving defensive kill rates comparable to or exceeding B-17 formations. Bomber losses were declining. Yet the technique violated a fundamental safety principle that had been doctrine for decades. In April 1944, the Army Air Force's Proving Ground Command at Eglin Field, Florida, conducted a formal evaluation of through-formation firing techniques. The test used P-40 fighters equipped with gun cameras, making simulated diving attacks against B-24 formations, while ground observers tracked bullet trajectories using high-speed cameras and geometric analysis. The testing ran for 3 weeks and involved over 200 simulated combat engagements. The Eglin Report, completed May 8, 1944, concluded that through-formation firing could be executed safely if gunners maintained proper fire discipline. The report calculated that with 300-foot vertical spacing between formation layers, properly trained gunners firing at diving targets could maintain safety margins exceeding 100 feet from friendly aircraft. The report noted that this margin decreased significantly if gunners failed to cease fire promptly or if formation spacing was reduced below 300 feet. The report included a critical recommendation. Through-formation firing should be authorized only for B-24 formations with their required wider spacing. B-17 formations, which maintained tighter spacing, should continue following standard firing doctrine. The technique was aircraft-specific, not universally applicable. By summer 1944, the strategic air war over Europe was entering its final phase. The introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters providing escort to and from targets deep inside Germany had fundamentally changed the tactical equation. German fighter opposition, while still dangerous, was declining due to unsustainable attrition rates. Luftwaffe pilot losses during the first 6 months of 1944 exceeded 3,000, killed or missing. Experienced pilots were being replaced by undertrained replacements with as few as 30 hours in type before being committed to combat. The decline in German fighter effectiveness reduced the opportunities for bomber gunners to employ defensive firing techniques, but several missions during summer 1944 demonstrated the continued value of through-formation firing when opposition was encountered. On July 7, 1944, the 15th Air Force dispatched 460 B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds to attack synthetic oil refineries at Blechhammer, Germany, deep in Silesia, near the Polish border. This was one of the longest missions flown from Italian bases, over 1,300 miles round trip. The formations were intercepted by approximately 60 German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 52 and Jagdgeschwader 301, units that had been transferred from the Eastern Front specifically to defend the critical oil targets. The German fighters employed aggressive tactics, including diving attacks through the bomber formations. The 454th Bomb Group, flying B-24 seconds in the lead combat wing, engaged multiple diving attacks using through-formation firing. Post-mission reports credited gunners from the 454th with 7 confirmed kills and 11 probables. Technical Sergeant Eugene Morrison, a top turret gunner flying his 38th mission, engaged a Messerschmitt Bf 109 diving from 12 o'clock high at approximately 10:30 that morning. Morrison's combat report, preserved in the 454th Bomb Group mission files, described the engagement. Enemy aircraft dove through our formation from high forward position, passing between our aircraft and the high squadron. I tracked the target, estimated 3 ship lengths lead, and fired a 4-second burst as the fighter descended through the gap. I observed strikes on the enemy aircraft's fuselage and right wing. The aircraft rolled inverted and descended trailing white smoke, likely coolant. I ceased fire when the target descended below the safe firing zone. Estimated closest approach of my tracers to friendly aircraft in high squadron was 100 to 150 feet. Morrison's engagement was typical of dozens that occurred during the Blechhammer mission. The 454th Bomb Group completed the mission without losses to fighters, though 3 aircraft sustained flak damage. German records captured after the war confirmed that Jagdgeschwader 52 lost 4 fighters during the engagement, with claims of 2 pilots killed and 2 wounded. The human dimension of through-formation firing extended beyond the gunners pulling triggers. Pilots and crew members in bombers that had friendly tracers passing near their aircraft experienced significant psychological stress even when they understood the technique was deliberate and controlled. First Lieutenant David Kellerman, pilot of a B-24 named Lady Luck, flying with the 461st Bomb Group, described the experience in a letter home dated July 15, 1944. Yesterday, we flew a long mission to Germany. German fighters hit us hard over the target. I watched tracers from bombers in the low squadron coming up past our aircraft, maybe a couple 100 feet to our right. I knew what they were doing. They were shooting at Germans, diving through the formation. The technique works, and I'm glad they're defending the formation aggressively. But watching those tracers coming up from below, knowing they're 50 caliber rounds from our own guys, creates this split-second moment where your brain screams, incoming fire, before your rational mind processes that it's friendly fire, directed at an enemy you can't see from your position. It's unsettling even when you understand exactly what's happening. The psychological dimension revealed something about human perception and threat assessment. Tracers were tracers. The human brain processed the visual stimulus of incoming fire before conscious analysis could determine whether the fire was friendly or hostile. Pilots and crew members whose aircraft were near the path of through-formation fire experienced instinctive stress responses, even though they intellectually understood the fire wasn't directed at them. This psychological factor became part of the training evolution. By August 1944, crew training for B-24 units included briefings that explained through-formation firing, not just to gunners, but to all crew members. Pilots, navigators, and bombardiers were taught to recognize the visual signature of through-formation firing and understand that tracers passing near their aircraft might be friendly fire directed at German fighters diving through formation gaps. This training reduced the psychological stress and prevented pilots from taking evasive action when friendly gunners were engaging targets. The technique's effectiveness was documented in comprehensive statistics compiled by the Army Air Force's Operational Analysis Section. During the 6-month period from March through August 1944, 15th Air Force B-24 units trained in through-formation firing achieved defensive kill rates, averaging 1 confirmed German fighter destroyed per 3,100 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition expended. B-24 units that had not adopted the technique, primarily groups that joined the 15th Air Force later and hadn't received the specialized training, averaged 1 kill per 7,200 rounds. The difference represented a direct correlation between training in through-formation firing and combat effectiveness. The technique more than doubled defensive kill rates, while bomber loss rates to fighter attacks declined by approximately 40% compared to January 1944 levels. But statistics didn't capture individual moments of courage and skill. Staff Sergeant Donald Whitmore, the waist gunner who had watched Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter shoot through the formation on February 19th, flew 47 missions with the 98th Bomb Group before completing his tour in August 1944. His final mission report, filed August 23rd after a raid on the Moravska Ostrava oil refinery in Czechoslovakia, included a brief notation. Engaged 3 enemy aircraft using through formation firing technique. 1 confirmed kill, 2 probables. No friendly aircraft endangered during engagements. Whitmore's terse notation represented what had become routine by late summer 1944. Gunners who had been trained in the technique employed it when appropriate, documented their actions in standard report formats, and returned to base. The revolutionary had become conventional. The technique that violated fundamental doctrine in February had become standard operating procedure by August. The broader institutional transformation was equally significant. The Army Air Forces had confronted a situation where established doctrine proved inadequate for specific operational realities. Combat crews had developed an alternative technique that contradicted regulations but improved effectiveness. The institution had tested the technique, validated its effectiveness, accepted the calculated risk it entailed, and incorporated it into doctrine. This represented organizational learning at a pace that was unusual for large military bureaucracies. The transformation was not without cost. During the period from February through August 1944, 3 incidents of friendly fire involving through formation firing were documented in 15th Air Force records. On March 29th, a B-24 from the 455th Bomb Group sustained minor damage when a .50 caliber round from a friendly aircraft struck the vertical stabilizer. No casualties resulted. On May 16th, a B-24 from the 461st Bomb Group was struck by 2 rounds from friendly fire. 1 round penetrated the fuselage without striking any crew members or critical systems. The second round struck the number 3 engine cowling, causing minor damage that was repaired after the mission. On July 9th, a waist gunner aboard a B-24 from the 456th Bomb Group sustained a minor wound when a .50 caliber round, believed to have been fired by a gunner on another bomber, struck a structural member and sent a fragment into the gunner's leg. The wound required medical treatment, but the gunner returned to flight status within 2 weeks. 3 incidents involving 4 crew injuries and minor aircraft damage in 6 months, during which B-24 formations flew. Hundreds of missions and expended millions of rounds of ammunition represented an acceptable casualty rate given the operational benefits. For comparison, German fighters and flak killed or wounded approximately 4,000 15th Air Force crew members during the same period. The friendly fire risk was statistically insignificant compared to enemy fire risk. The technique's value extended beyond raw statistics. It demonstrated adaptability, the capacity to question established doctrine when combat experience revealed limitations, test alternative approaches, and implement improvements rapidly. This adaptability became characteristic of American air operations during World War II. The Pacific Theater provided an interesting contrast. B-24 units operating from bases in the Southwest Pacific and China-Burma-India Theater faced different tactical situations than European-based units. Japanese fighter opposition declined significantly during 1944 as the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces suffered catastrophic attrition. By mid-1944, many B-24 missions in the Pacific encountered little or no fighter opposition. The bombing campaign focused increasingly on targets in areas where Japanese air defenses had been degraded or destroyed. This meant Pacific B-24 units had fewer opportunities to employ through formation firing against diving fighters. However, several units adopted the technique after receiving information about 15th Air Force experiences. The technique remained part of crew training as a capability that could be employed if tactical situations required it. This represented sound military practice, maintaining capabilities even when immediate need was minimal, recognizing that circumstances could change. By autumn 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was achieving its objectives through systematic destruction of oil production, transportation, infrastructure, and industrial capacity. The Luftwaffe was approaching collapse not from any single tactical defeat, but from cumulative attrition that exceeded replacement capacity. German fighter pilot training had been reduced to dangerously low levels. Fuel shortages grounded entire units. Allied air superiority was so complete that daytime bomber formations often encountered no fighter opposition at all. The final months of the war saw relatively few opportunities for bomber gunners to employ defensive firing techniques of any kind, but the development of through-formation firing remained significant for what it revealed about tactical evolution and organizational learning. The technique emerged from combat necessity, was validated through systematic testing, and was incorporated into doctrine despite contradicting established safety principles. This pattern of innovation, driven by operational necessity, appeared repeatedly in military aviation during World War II and established precedents for post-war tactical development. The post-war analysis of bomber defensive tactics included detailed examination of through-formation firing. The Army Air Force's Tactical School incorporated case studies of the technique into their curriculum by 1946. The technique became an example used in officer education to illustrate the importance of questioning doctrine when combat experience revealed limitations, testing alternative approaches systematically, and implementing validated improvements even when they required accepting calculated risks. Modern air warfare has rendered formation defensive gunnery obsolete. Contemporary bombers like the B-2 Spirit rely on stealth characteristics to avoid detection rather than defensive armament to defeat attacks. Fighter aircraft engage targets at ranges measured in tens of miles using radar-guided missiles, making visual range gunnery encounters essentially non-existent. The B-52 Stratofortress, which entered service in 1952 and remains in service today, was the last American bomber to carry defensive guns, and those were removed in 1991. But the principles revealed by through-formation firing remain relevant. Military organizations must balance adherence to established doctrine with the need to adapt when operational realities demand new approaches. Safety principles serve critical purposes, but cannot be applied so rigidly that they prevent effective responses to tactical problems. The challenge lies in distinguishing between doctrine that should be preserved and doctrine that must evolve. The statistical transformation achieved by 15th Air Force B-24 units tells the essential story. In January 1944, before through-formation firing was developed, B-24 formations achieved defensive kill rates of approximately 1 German fighter destroyed per 9,000 rounds of ammunition expended. By August 1944, after widespread adoption of through-formation firing, kill rates had improved to 1 per 3,000 rounds. The technique tripled defensive effectiveness while maintaining safety margins that resulted in negligible friendly fire casualties. For the individual gunners who executed the technique, the experience represented something more than statistical improvement. It represented the responsibility of making split-second decisions with lethal consequences, the psychological burden of deliberately firing in directions that could endanger fellow Americans, and the courage required to employ tactics that contradicted everything their training had taught them about safety. Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter, whose decision to fire through the formation on February 19, 1944, had demonstrated the technique to Staff Sergeant Donald Whitmore, completed 50 missions with the 98th Bomb Group. He was credited with 4 confirmed kills and 9 probables, using through-formation firing. Porter survived the war, returned to Pennsylvania, and lived until 1993. In an interview conducted by the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1987, Porter was asked about through-formation firing. People ask if it was scary to shoot when other B-24 seconds were nearby. Of course it was scary. Everything about flying combat missions was scary. But you learn to do your job despite the fear. The technique worked. We shot down Germans who were trying to kill us. We protected the formation. Nobody in our group got hit by friendly fire from through-formation shooting. We were professionals. We trained until we could execute the technique properly. Then we did it when the tactical situation required it. That's what soldiers do. Porter's matter-of-fact description captured the essence of military professionalism. The technique required exceptional skill and discipline. It entailed calculated risks. But when those risks were justified by operational necessity and could be managed through proper training, professional soldiers executed the mission. The broader context of strategic bombing provides perspective on through-formation firing's significance. The combined bomber offensive, the systematic Allied air campaign against Germany, dropped approximately 2.7 million tons of bombs on Axis targets between 1942 and 1945. The 15th Air Force alone flew over 148,000 sorties and dropped over 300,000 tons of bombs. These operations required extraordinary courage from bomber crews who faced intense opposition during 1943 and 1944. Bomber losses were catastrophic during the period before long-range fighter escorts became available. The 8th Air Force, operating from England, lost over 4,700 B-17 seconds during the war. The 15th Air Force lost over 3,300 B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds combined. Each lost bomber represented 10 men, killed, captured, or missing. Total casualties exceeded 50,000 for the 8th Air Force and 30,000 for the 15th Air Force. These losses, horrific as they were, represented the cost of destroying Germany's capacity to continue the war. Strategic bombing devastated German oil production, aircraft manufacturing, transportation networks, and industrial capacity. The campaign forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense. Over 1 million German personnel were assigned to flak units. Thousands of fighters and pilots were committed to homeland defense, preventing their deployment against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front or Allied forces in Italy and France. Through formation firing represented one small tactical innovation among hundreds that collectively improved bomber survivability and mission effectiveness. The technique didn't win the war. No single tactical innovation did. But techniques like through formation firing, combined with improved fighter, escorts, better formation tactics, advanced electronic countermeasures, and systematic targeting of critical German industries, made the strategic bombing campaign effective enough to achieve its objectives, while keeping casualties at levels the Allies could sustain. The human stories behind the statistics deserve remembrance. Staff Sergeant Eugene Morrison, who engaged the diving Messerschmitt over Blechhammer on July 7, 1944, completed 43 missions before being killed on his 44th mission on December 17, 1944, during a raid on the Blechhammer oil refinery, the same target he had attacked in July. His B-24 was shot down by flak. No parachutes were observed. Morrison was 23 years old. Technical Sergeant Lawrence DiPietro, whose diary entry captured the psychological burden of through-formation firing, survived the war. He completed 50 missions with the 455th Bomb Group, returned to New York, and worked as a machinist until his retirement in 1985. He rarely spoke about his war experiences. His diary remained private until his family donated it to the Air Force Museum after his death. First Lieutenant David Kellerman, who described watching friendly tracers pass near his aircraft, completed 51 missions as a B-24 pilot. He remained in the Air Force after the war, flew B-29 seconds during the Korean War, and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1963. In his retirement, Kellerman became active in veterans organizations and frequently spoke to school groups about World War II. His standard message emphasized the importance of adaptability and learning from experience, lessons he attributed directly to his combat experiences, watching tactical innovations like through-formation firing emerge from operational necessity. The legacy of through-formation firing extends beyond tactical aviation into broader questions about military innovation and organizational learning. How do military organizations balance the need for standardized doctrine with the need to adapt to changing circumstances? How do they distinguish between safety principles that must be preserved and doctrine that requires evolution? How do they incorporate lessons learned from combat experience into institutional knowledge rapidly enough to benefit current operations rather than just future conflicts? These questions remain relevant in contemporary military operations. Modern warfare evolves rapidly. Technologies change. Adversaries develop new tactics. Operational environments present unexpected challenges. Military organizations must maintain the capacity to learn, adapt, and innovate while preserving the discipline and standardization that enable coordinated operations. The B-24 gunners who learned to fire through their own formations in winter 1944 demonstrated that ordinary soldiers, when properly trained and led, could execute techniques requiring extraordinary skill and discipline. They proved that combat effectiveness sometimes requires challenging established doctrine, accepting calculated risks, and trusting training and professionalism to manage those risks safely. The technique they developed lasted only months before changing circumstances reduced its relevance. By late 1944, German fighter opposition had declined so significantly that opportunities to employ through-formation firing became rare. The technique never became permanent doctrine because the tactical situation that created the need for it proved temporary. But the principle it represented, that doctrine must adapt to operational realities rather than demanding operational realities conform to doctrine, remains permanently valid. The young men who crouched behind 50-caliber machine guns at 22,000 feet over Germany, who made split-second decisions about when to fire and when to cease fire, who calculated angles and leads, and safe firing zones while freezing and exhausted and terrified, proved that humans can adapt to circumstances evolution never anticipated. They demonstrated that training can overcome instinct, that discipline can manage calculated risks, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demands it. Staff Sergeant Donald Whitmore, who watched Raymond Porter fire through the formation on February 19th, 1944, and later adopted the technique himself, survived the war and returned to Ohio. He worked as an electrician, raised 4 children, and rarely discussed his combat experiences. In 1996, 2 years before his death, he attended a reunion of the 98th Bomb Group. A younger relative asked him what he was most proud of from his war service. Whitmore's answer, recorded in the reunion minutes, reflected the perspective of a man who had experienced combat and survived to understand its meaning. "I'm proud we did our job. We flew the missions. We defended the formation. We brought our crews home when we could. We learned to do things we didn't think were possible. We adapted. We overcame. That's what Americans do when they have to. We didn't quit. We figured out what worked, and we did it. That's all. We did our job." That simple statement captures the essence of through-formation firing and the men who executed it. They faced a tactical problem that was causing catastrophic losses. They developed a solution that required exceptional skill, challenged fundamental doctrine, and demanded courage to execute. They trained until they could perform the technique safely. Then they employed it when necessary, saved lives, completed their missions, and came home. The tracers that lanced through formation gaps over Germany in 1944 represented more than bullets seeking targets. They represented human adaptability, professional skill, institutional learning, and the capacity of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when faced with challenges that permit no other response. This remains their legacy, more enduring than statistics or tactics or technologies that have long since become obsolete. They proved what humans can do when survival demands it. That lesson never becomes obsolete. The mathematical elegance of through-formation firing reveals itself only in retrospect. During combat, there was no time for elegant calculations. Gunners operated on training, instinct, and split-second judgment. But analyzing the technique from a distance shows how precisely it exploited the specific characteristics of B-24 formations and German diving attack profiles. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 diving at a 45-degree angle at 400 miles per hour descended at approximately 290 feet per second vertically. The 300-foot gap between B-24 formation layers took the diving fighter approximately 1 second to traverse. During that 1 second, a gunner firing a Browning M2 at 750 rounds per minute would expend 12 to 13 rounds if he maintained continuous fire. But the geometry was more complex. The gunner wasn't firing straight up at the diving fighter. He was tracking a target moving at an angle, which required lead, at typical engagement ranges of 400 to 600 yards, with closing speeds approaching 600 miles per hour when accounting for the bomber's forward motion. Proper deflection required aiming 2 to 3 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target position. This meant the gunner was firing at where the fighter would be approximately 1/3 of a second in the future. His bullets, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, covered 400 yards in approximately half a second. The entire engagement, from target acquisition to cease fire, lasted perhaps 3 seconds. During those 3 seconds, the gunner had to identify the target as hostile, assess the dive angle, calculate lead, track smoothly while accounting for his own aircraft's motion and turbulence, fire, observe fall of shot, adjust if necessary, and cease fire the instant the target descended below the safe engagement zone. Technical training could teach the mechanics, but executing under combat stress, at high altitude in extreme cold, while wearing bulky flight gear and breathing through an oxygen mask, required something beyond training. It required what military psychologists would later term stress inoculation, the capacity to perform complex motor and cognitive tasks under conditions of extreme physiological and psychological stress. The gunners who successfully employed through-formation firing had developed this capacity through repetition. Most had flown 20 to 30 missions before attempting the technique in combat. They had experienced German fighter attacks repeatedly. They had fired thousands of rounds at enemy aircraft. Their hands knew the weight and feel of the gun controls. Their eyes had learned to track fast-moving targets through the optical sight. Their minds had absorbed the geometry of deflection shooting until calculations that initially required conscious thought became automatic responses. This accumulation of experience created what cognitive psychologists call expert intuition, the ability to make accurate judgments rapidly without conscious deliberation. Expert gunners didn't consciously calculate that a Messerschmitt diving at a specific angle required 3 aircraft lengths of lead. They looked at the target, and their hands moved the guns to the correct position automatically. The skill had been internalized through repetition until it became as natural as catching a thrown ball, another task that requires complex calculations executed unconsciously. The importance of this expertise became clear when replacement gunners, fresh from stateside training schools with no combat experience, attempted through-formation firing. Loss records show that aircraft with high percentages of replacement crew members suffered higher casualty rates than aircraft with experienced crews. Part of this disparity resulted from replacement pilots being less skilled at formation flying, but post-mission analysis also showed that inexperienced gunners were less effective at defensive fire generally and specifically struggled with the split-second timing required for through-formation firing. The 15th Air Force addressed this by implementing a policy in May 1944, requiring that replacement gunners fly at least 5 missions in positions where through-formation firing would not be required before, being assigned to positions where they might need to employ the technique. This allowed new gunners to accumulate combat experience and develop stress tolerance before facing the demands of through-formation firing. The policy reflected a sophisticated understanding of skill, acquisition, and stress management. You couldn't teach through-formation firing effectively to gunners who were still learning to cope with the basic stress of combat operations. They needed to first become comfortable with high-altitude formation, flying, enemy fighter attacks, and flak. Only after that baseline stress had been normalized could they develop the additional skills required for through-formation firing. This principle, that complex skills should be introduced progressively after foundational skills are mastered, has become standard in modern military training. But in 1944, it represented an insight developed from analyzing combat performance and loss patterns rather than from theoretical training models. The German perspective on through-formation firing provides additional context. Luftwaffe intelligence units analyzed American bomber defensive tactics systematically throughout the war. After-action reports from pilots, analysis of combat footage from gun, cameras, and interrogations of captured American crew members provided comprehensive information about American tactics and techniques. A Luftwaffe intelligence summary dated September 19, 1944, captured by Allied forces in May 1945 and now preserved in the National Archives, includes a section on American defensive gunnery. The document, translated from German, notes, American heavy bomber formations, particularly those of the consolidated B-24 type, have demonstrated improved defensive fire discipline in recent months. Diving attacks through formation gaps now encounter concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft. Pilots report that American gunners are firing at steep angles that appear to place rounds near other American aircraft. This suggests either improved fire control coordination or acceptance of friendly fire risk to increase defensive effectiveness. Regardless of cause, the result is increased difficulty and danger in executing diving attacks against American formations. The German analysis correctly identified that American gunners were employing a technique that placed rounds near friendly aircraft, but didn't fully understand the specific geometry and training that made the technique possible. The assessment that it might represent improved fire control coordination suggests the Germans considered the possibility that some form of centralized fire control was directing multiple gunners to fire simultaneously. This was incorrect. Through formation firing was executed by individual gunners using visual tracking and their own judgment about when to fire and cease fire. The German response was tactical adaptation. By autumn 1944, Luftwaffe units attacking American bomber formations were avoiding diving attacks through formation gaps when possible. This represented exactly the outcome American tactical planners had sought. If German fighters avoided diving attacks, they were forced to employ alternative attack profiles that either exposed them to defensive fire for longer periods or were less effective at inflicting bomber casualties. The strategic context of autumn 1944 shaped how through-formation firing was employed during the final months of the European War. By October, Allied air superiority over Europe was so complete that German fighter opposition had become sporadic. Many bomber missions encountered no fighters at all. When fighters did attack, they were often flown by poorly trained replacement pilots whose effectiveness was minimal. This meant the frequency of through-formation firing decreased significantly during the last 6 months of the war. The technique remained part of standard crew training and procedures, but opportunities to employ it became rare. Several missions in late 1944 and early 1945 saw no use of through-formation firing simply because German fighters didn't attack formations using diving profiles that required it. The technique's brief operational lifespan, roughly 8 months from initial development to widespread adoption to declining relevance, was typical of tactical innovations during World War II. The pace of technological and tactical change meant that techniques could become obsolete within months. Aircraft that were cutting-edge one year were outclassed the next. Tactics that dominated in 1943 were countered by 1944. The war moved at a pace that made long-term planning difficult and placed a premium on rapid adaptation. But the principle behind through-formation firing, that effectiveness sometimes requires accepting calculated risks and challenging established doctrine, remained relevant long after the specific technique became obsolete. Military organizations continue to face situations where established procedures prove inadequate for new circumstances. The through-formation firing case study provides a model for how to respond. Analyze the problem systematically, develop and test potential solutions, validate effectiveness through controlled implementation, and then decide whether the benefits justify changing doctrine. Modern military decision-making processes incorporate this model explicitly. The concept of operational experimentation, where new tactics or technologies are tested in realistic conditions before widespread adoption, follows the same pattern used to validate through-formation firing. The recognition that combat experience provides insights that theoretical analysis might miss has become institutionalized in after-action review processes and lessons learned systems. The individual gunners who employed through-formation firing in combat were largely unaware they were participating in a significant tactical innovation. From their perspective, they were using a technique their instructors taught them to solve a specific problem they encountered regularly. The broader institutional significance, the challenge to established doctrine, the precedent being set for tactical adaptation, none of that was apparent or relevant during combat operations. This disconnect between individual experience and institutional significance appears throughout military history. Soldiers execute tactics and techniques focused entirely on immediate tactical problems, survival, and mission success. Only later does analysis reveal broader patterns and principles. The soldiers who fought at Lexington and Concord didn't know they were demonstrating the effectiveness of irregular warfare against conventional forces. The infantrymen who stormed Normandy beaches didn't understand they were validating amphibious assault doctrine. They were focused on getting across the beach alive. Similarly, B-24 gunners employing through-formation firing were focused on shooting down German fighters and protecting their formation. The tactical innovation, the challenge to doctrine, the validation of adaptive learning processes, all of that came from analysis and reflection, not from the immediate combat experience. This suggests something important about military innovation. Often the most significant innovations emerge from practitioners solving immediate problems rather than from theoretical analysis trying to optimize future operations. Combat reveals problems that peacetime analysis doesn't anticipate. Solutions developed under combat stress are tested immediately against real opposition with actual consequences. Ineffective solutions are discarded quickly. Effective solutions spread rapidly through informal channels even before formal doctrine is modified. The through-formation firing technique spread through exactly this pattern. Combat crews developed it, tested it, refined it, and shared it with other crews. Only after its effectiveness was demonstrated did institutional validation and formal doctrine modification occur. The innovation moved from bottom-up rather than top-down, from the tactical level to the institutional level rather than the reverse. Modern military organizations try to capture this dynamic through structured feedback mechanisms, but the fundamental challenge remains: how do you create organizational structures that enable rapid innovation while maintaining the discipline and standardization necessary for coordinated operations? Through-formation firing succeeded because the Army Air Forces found a balance. The technique contradicted established doctrine, but once its effectiveness was proven, the institution modified doctrine rather than suppressing the innovation. That institutional flexibility, the willingness to change established procedures when evidence demonstrated the need, represented a significant cultural achievement. Military organizations tend toward conservatism for good reasons. Standardized procedures enable coordination. Proven tactics reduce risk. Changing doctrine without sufficient justification can introduce more problems than it solves. But excessive conservatism prevents adaptation to changing circumstances. The Army Air Forces during World War II maintained remarkable balance between these competing demands. The organization standardized training, doctrine, and procedures sufficiently to enable coordinated mass operations involving thousands of aircraft. But it also maintained sufficient flexibility to incorporate innovations like through-formation firing when combat experience demonstrated their value. This balance was not accidental. Senior leaders like General Nathan Twining, who authorized through-formation firing for the 15th Air Force, understood that doctrine should serve operational effectiveness rather than becoming an end in itself. Twining's decision to modify firing restrictions despite their basis in fundamental safety principles represented exactly this understanding. He evaluated the evidence, assessed the risks and benefits, and made a judgment that changing doctrine would improve operational effectiveness while maintaining acceptable safety margins. Not all military organizations in World War II maintained this balance successfully. Several examples exist of organizations that suppressed tactical innovations because they contradicted established doctrine, or that failed to identify and disseminate effective techniques because institutional learning mechanisms were inadequate. The Allied ability to innovate tactically and operationally more rapidly than Axis forces contributed significantly to ultimate victory. The final accounting of through-formation firing must acknowledge both its contributions and its limitations. The technique significantly improved B-24 defensive effectiveness during a critical period. It reduced bomber losses. It increased German fighter losses. These were meaningful tactical achievements that saved American lives and enhanced mission effectiveness. But the technique didn't change the strategic outcome of the war. Strategic bombing succeeded because of overwhelming Allied industrial capacity, systematic targeting of critical German industries, achievement of air superiority through fighter escorts, and attrition of German pilot strength, and the cumulative effect of sustained operations over years. Through-formation firing was one small element in this massive campaign. This perspective is important. Military history sometimes focuses on tactical innovations and technical solutions, while understating the fundamental importance of strategy, logistics, industrial capacity, and sustained effort. Tactics matter. Techniques matter, but they matter within larger contexts of strategic objectives, operational campaigns, and resource allocation. The B-24 gunners who employed through formation firing contributed to winning World War II. But they won through the cumulative effect of thousands of missions flown, hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs dropped, sustained attrition of German fighter forces, and systematic destruction of German industrial capacity. The through formation firing technique made their missions somewhat more effective and somewhat less costly. That contribution, while significant for the crews whose lives it may have saved, was modest in the context of the overall strategic bombing campaign. This realistic assessment doesn't diminish the courage or skill of the gunners who executed the technique. It simply acknowledges that individual tactical innovations, however clever or effective, rarely determine strategic outcomes. Wars are won by sustained effort, superior resources, better strategy, and ultimately, by nations' capacity to mobilize their populations and industries for total war. The United States possessed overwhelming advantages in industrial capacity, resource availability, technological capability, and organizational effectiveness. These fundamental advantages made victory possible. Tactical innovations like through formation firing helped translate these advantages into operational success more efficiently, but they didn't create the advantages. The legacy of through formation firing lies not in its strategic impact, but in what it demonstrates about tactical adaptation, organizational learning, and human capability under extreme stress. The technique showed that doctrine can and should evolve when combat experience reveals limitations. It demonstrated that calculated risks can be justified when potential benefits are substantial, and risks can be managed through training and discipline. It proved that ordinary soldiers, properly trained and led, can execute techniques requiring extraordinary skill and judgment. These lessons remain applicable in contemporary military operations and beyond. The principle that established procedures should be questioned when evidence suggests they're inadequate applies in any field where circumstances change and effectiveness depends on adaptation. The understanding that expertise develops through repeated exposure and practice under realistic conditions informs modern training methodologies. The recognition that accepting calculated risks is sometimes necessary for achieving objectives shapes risk management frameworks across military and civilian domains. Staff Sergeant Donald Whitmore, who learned through formation firing from watching Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter on February 19th, 1944, represents thousands of young men who served as bomber gunners during World War II. They volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in military service. They endured conditions of extreme cold, high altitude, and sustained combat stress. They faced German fighters and flak while sitting in unpressurized bombers at 20,000 feet. They watched friends die, attended memorial services, and climbed back into their aircraft for the next mission. They did this because they believed their service mattered, that they were fighting for something larger than MS themselves. That belief sustained them through experiences that left psychological scars, many carried for decades. The bomber crews of World War II, whether they flew B-17 seconds, B-24 seconds, B-29 seconds, or other aircraft, whether they served in Europe, the Pacific, or other theaters, deserve remembrance not just for their tactical contributions, but for their courage, endurance, and sacrifice. The through formation firing technique was one chapter in their story. It was a solution to a specific problem faced during a specific period. The technique worked. Lives were saved. Missions succeeded. Then circumstances changed, the problem evolved, and the specific technique became less relevant. But the men who developed it, trained in it, and employed it in combat demonstrated capabilities that remain worth remembering and honoring. They proved that humans can adapt to demands evolution never prepared them for. They showed that training can enable performance under conditions of extreme stress. They demonstrated that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. These truths transcend the specific technique or the specific war. They represent fundamental insights about human capability and potential. The bombers are gone now, scrapped after the war, or preserved in museums, where visitors can walk through them and try to imagine what combat must have been like. The men who flew them are nearly all gone too, passing with the years. But the lessons they taught through their service, their courage, their adaptability, and their sacrifice remain. Through formation firing was one small example of those lessons, a footnote in the history of strategic bombing, but significant for what it reveals about the men who fought and the principles they embodied. In the end, that may be the most important legacy. Not the tactical innovation itself, but what it demonstrates about human beings under extreme stress, about organizations learning and adapting, about the capacity to overcome challenges through skill, courage, and determination. Those principles never become obsolete. They remain as relevant today as they were over Germany in 1944, and they will remain relevant as long as humans face challenges that demand more than they believe themselves capable of providing. The tracers that lanced through formation gaps in the cold sky over Europe were more than bullets seeking targets. They were evidence of human adaptability, proof that we can learn to do what seems impossible, verification that courage and skill and training can enable achievements that instinct says should be beyond our reach. Staff Sergeant Donald Whitmore and thousands like him proved this every time they flew. That is their enduring gift to us, more valuable than any tactical technique, more lasting than any technology. They showed us what humans can do. That lesson never fades. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.